I've been stewing on this for a while, and I have to confess that it has been difficult to wrap my head around. But I'll also say that it has really helped me to focus my own thoughts in my life. It's caused me to ask a single question that's made a lot of difference for me. That question is, what was Jesus all about? If I don't understand that, then I don't think I stand a chance of reflecting Jesus to a confused world. Because when I am confused, the message that I send is going to be equally confused. So I want to ask you to follow me on a journey this evening. I want you to consider what Jesus is about and what happens to people who meet him. Now, I need to ask you to do something that I realize is almost impossible. I want to ask you to try your very best to forget the gospel accounts. I know that's kind of a goofy thing, but go with me on this. Forget that you ever heard anything about a man that was God in the flesh. Forget the stories that you've known since childhood. And I want you to try to approach this with childlike wonder. And to help you, let me ask you a couple of questions. Have you ever been in a wild thunderstorm? Was there anyone with you that could just simply say, "Stop, be still," and the storm would actually stop? I highly doubt it. Have you ever known someone that was deathly ill and wished that there was a person you could ask and they could simply say, "They will be fine," and it would be so? Again, I highly doubt it. In my own personal journey with various things, I've come across people that just wanted to have a positive mindset, and they've told Megan and I things like, "Don't worry, you'll have a baby," or something along those lines. And something that I've learned in that season and in that journey is this: people, though they have the best intentions, they do not have the authority to write that check, much less cash it, as much as they might want to. They can't simply say those words and make those things happen. And that's the reality of the world in which we live. So I want you to remember the incredible nature of the things that you're about to hear. In many regards, they've become familiar to us, and I really think that can be to our detriment. I want you to remember what is impossible for you, and I want you to listen with that in mind. So go with me on this journey, forgetting what you've known all along. There was a group of men that were going to sail across the Sea of Galilee. It was a trip that they had made many times before, and since many of them had grown up as fishermen, they were well acquainted with that sea and sailing on it. This particular evening, they got a late start, and as they sailed, the sky above them began to turn dark. And before long, a furious windstorm came on the sea, and with it came the waves. Now, having been on a sailboat myself, when the wind really picks up and when a storm arises, I can tell you that this is an unsettling experience. You see, when the wind rises, the waves, they begin to rise with it, and they start rolling over themselves with white caps of foam. And then you start to feel the strain on the sail, and the boat starts leaning heavily to one side as the wind blows on the sail, and you become very much at the mercy of the wind. Now, in a fishing boat, it would have been designed to carry fish, and so the hull would be one solid piece, and it would have been a relatively small boat, but it's designed to hold fish. But that also means if water comes into the boat, it holds water too. And as the boat begins to lean harder from the wind on the sails, the gunnels get closer to the surface of the water every time it tilts. And the water starts splashing into the boat. And then those fishermen, they start to worry. Because you and I both know water is supposed to stay out of the boat. And since they're in a relatively small boat, the more weight that gets into that boat, the more unstable that boat becomes. And those men begin to realize something. We are in danger. We might sink, and there is no way that we could swim to shore. We're minutes from death. So they begin to bail water out as fast as possible, but they can't keep up with the waves. Now at this point, the men realize there's one more man on board, and he's been in the stern asleep through this whole terrifying experience. And so they woke him up and exclaimed, "Don't you care if we drown and if we die?" I can only imagine that he gets up and doesn't really seem to have any sense of concern or worry, and he speaks to the storm. "Quiet. Be still," as if talking to a petulant little child. Of all the things that those men thought to do, I would suspect that speaking to the storm, telling it to stop, was probably not one of them. They may have wished that the storm would stop, but I highly doubt that they thought of actually telling it to stop. And I suspect to their surprise, the raging wind and waves, this storm that was threatening their lives just seconds before, it just stopped. And there was a calm. The man turned and asked them, "Where is your faith?" The men were no longer scared for their lives, but they were still afraid. And they marveled. They began to question, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." Can you imagine that? Can you sense the fear and the panic in the disciples as they labored against the wind and against the waves? And then Jesus simply speaks, saying, "Shh, quiet, be still," rebuking the wind and the waves. And they obeyed him. This is no ordinary man. Yes, he had healed people not long before this, but having absolute control and power over a force of nature like the wind and the waves, this was another level. I can guarantee you this was an event that those men remembered, and an event that very likely changed them, and they could never be the same. So they continue sailing, and they head on over to the region of the Gerasenes, which was opposite from Galilee. And no sooner than they had stepped out of the boat, there came a wild man running towards them. This man was dirty, he was scarred, he was naked, and he was crazy. It was very clear that he was possessed by a demon, and probably much more. He no longer lived in society because he was out of control. Instead, He lived among the tombs, where people don't readily go. This man, he was somebody's son. He was probably somebody's brother. He was a man that very likely had not always been this way. And if I were to guess, I would be willing to bet that his family had tried their very best to help him in any way they knew how. Imagine your own family for just a moment. If anybody in your own family had a serious problem, I have no doubt that you would do anything that you could to help them overcome that problem. And if you were unable, it would break your heart to know they had become an outcast of society, that they lived far away from people and from human interaction, and that they were running around naked, with nothing on but the broken remnants of the shackles that had been bound to them to try to contain them. This man was living a very real life of torment, and nobody could help him. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said in a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" I suspect that this was a man that had become so notorious and scary that people usually just ran away from him. Nobody had likely asked him his name in years. He replied, "Legion." For many demons had entered him, and they begged Jesus not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now, a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter into these pigs, so Jesus gave them permission. Then the demons, they came out of the man, and they entered into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. I can hardly imagine what this would have looked like, but I think, based on the response, that it was a true spectacle. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. Everywhere they went, you get the idea that they were basically telling people, "You ain't gonna believe what just happened. You gotta come see this." And then the people went out to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw this man, the one from whom the demons had been driven out. He was sitting at the feet of Jesus. And probably for the first time in I don't know how many years, he was clothed and he was in his right mind. And the people, they were afraid. Those who had seen it, they told how the demon-possessed man had been healed. Then all of the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to depart from them, because they were all seized with very great fear. So he got into the boat and he returned. But the man who had been out of his mind and out of control of his own body for who knows how long, he was reluctant to see Jesus go. Jesus had just done for him what no man could do. He had taken this life of torment. He brought healing to it. He had quite literally redeemed him from the hell that he was living. So this man, he begged that he might be with Jesus. But Jesus sent him away, saying to him, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. This man, he got to go back to his home, where his family lived, where his friends lived, where the life that he knew before was. He got to go back to the place where everyone knew his story, even if he had never told them. Word of a madman like that, it was sure to get around. I mean, I know me personally, I would warn people, hey, you don't want to go that way. You know, Weird Harold lives out there. You should go this other way instead. But now, he was forever changed. He would never be the same. So he went about telling people how much Jesus had done for him. And it was undeniable by anyone. Now, when Jesus returned back across the sea, the crowd welcomed him because they were all waiting for him. So before this, the crowds had been accumulating as he was going from town to town preaching and healing. So they were waiting for him when he came back, and there came a man named Jairus. He was a ruler of the synagogue. Keep in mind that the Jewish leaders weren't exactly huge fans of Jesus at this point. So for a leader of the synagogue to come to Jesus, that's a big deal. Not only did Jairus come, but in complete and absolute humility, he falls at his feet. And he implored Jesus to come to his house because his only daughter, who was about 12 years old, was sick. She was dying. At this point, I am sure that desperation had set in. I know that parents will do almost anything for their children. And since Jesus had been in this region before, I have no doubt that Jairus had either seen or at least heard of the healing that Jesus had done before. So he knows what Jesus is capable of. And as Jesus went, the crowd of people pressed around him, and there was a woman there who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Though she spent all of her living on doctors, she could not be healed by anyone. She actually got worse instead of better. And knowing the Levitical laws, we know that this discharge of blood would have caused her to be considered unclean. And that means that anybody who touched her or that she touched would also become unclean. So she would have become an outcast of society. She couldn't sit on anything others would use, or touch anything others used, or touch other people, or vice versa. I can only imagine that she had to have a very strong sense of isolation and hopelessness. And nobody could help her situation. She continued to get worse for 12 years. She came up behind Jesus and she touched just the fringe of his garment. And immediately the impossible thing that had been ailing her and causing her to suffer, the impossible happened. Her discharge of blood ceased. Can you imagine the relief that she must have felt? Can you imagine the likely sense of overwhelming joy that would accompany relief from a serious ailment that had kept you isolated and made you an outcast of society for 12 years? Jesus, he knew what had happened, and he asked a question. Who was it that touched me? And I suspect that the joy that she experienced was pretty immediately covered with a feeling and a sense of dread and maybe fear. She'd been found out. But when all denied it, Peter says, Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you. But Jesus said, somebody touched me. I perceive that power has gone out from me. Again, that feeling of fear and dread you feel when you've done something that you knew you shouldn't have done, and you've been found out, that must have come over her, and there was no hiding. When the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling. She was afraid of the consequences. But falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him. She just told these Jewish people that they were very likely all unclean now, since she had been bleeding and she had been around them and had likely run into and bumped into many of them. But she also told them how she was immediately healed. Jesus said to her, Daughter. Such an endearing term. He didn't say to her woman or some generic term, but one of tender care. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Shalom. Go in peace. This woman, she'd been made clean by Jesus when nobody else could help, and nobody else could even come near her. He had redeemed her life of isolation. She must have been changed and could never be the same. But don't forget, this was on the way to Jairus' house and likely had slowed him down in getting to Jairus' house, where his 12-year-old daughter lay sick and dying rapidly. I can only imagine Jairus was thinking, we don't have time for this. My daughter is at home dying right now. Hurry up, let's go. But Jesus, he still took the time to tend to this woman. Beyond simply healing her body, he saw her and he comforted her. And he gave her peace that she had likely been missing in her life for 12 years. And while he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, Your daughter, she is dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. In a sense, it's too late now. But Jesus answered him, Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well. Now remember what I told you earlier? There have been times when people told me things in the past and I knew you don't have the authority to write that check and to cash it. And I suspect Jairus' daughter had been sick for some time, and I bet, with good intentions, people have said, Don't worry, she'll be fine. My daughter had something like this and it was no problem. But they, being people, they didn't have the authority to write and cash that check. And now, Jairus' daughter is dead, and this man says to him, Don't fear, only believe, and she will be well. That would be hard to believe. And when he had come to the house, he allowed nobody to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the father and the mother of the child, and all were weeping and mourning for her. But he said, Do not weep, for she is not dead, she's just sleeping. They all laughed at him. They knew that she was dead. Taking the hand of the child, he says, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned. She got up at once. Can you imagine? I know that some of you have suffered through the horrific pain of losing a child. Can you imagine a man coming in and saying, "Child, arise," and their spirit of life just returning? That doesn't just happen. He just did the impossible. He has the authority to say exactly what he said, and he demonstrated it by taking her by the hand and helping her up. And then he directed that something be given her to eat. And her parents, they were amazed. But he charged them to tell no one what had happened. But they weren't the only ones who knew about this. Yes, Peter, John, and James knew, but remember the crowd that was outside weeping? They knew she was dead. They laughed at Jesus when he said she was asleep. And now, she is not dead. News of things like this, it spreads. Word gets around. Jairus and his wife, they had experienced this new life that only Jesus had to offer. I can only imagine that their encounter with Jesus had changed them, and they could never be the same. Because Jesus, he changes people. Those that have come in contact with him are forever changed. They will never be the same. If you were on that boat in the sea, nearing death, the boat is sinking, and you are terrified. Jesus just spoke the words, "Quiet, be still." Would you keep that to yourself? Would that influence your thoughts about Jesus and his mission and his message? Absolutely it would. If it was me, you better believe I would listen to him even closer, seeing that he can speak to the storms and they obey him. If you were the madman that had been out of control of his own body for who knows how long and tormented by a legion of demons, would you tell others? You better believe you would, just like that man did. You couldn't help but show Jesus, the Christ, to the world around you simply by the difference he had made in you. If you were the woman, subject to bleeding for 12 years, isolated, outcast, poor, miserable, and hopeless, what would you do? Your life had been changed in an instant. I have no doubt that you would go around just like the demoniac, and you would tell everybody that you knew what Jesus had done for you. If you had just lost a child to illness and Jesus came and brought her back to life, you would never be the same. You would know that he is the Lord of all. And those around you would know that you had been changed. So what's the point? When we encounter Jesus, he changes us. He comes into our brokenness. He brings peace, he brings relief and forgiveness, and he brings healing. It's not always, and it's probably most of the time, not physical in nature. And in fact, if you look at the accounts in the Gospels, the miracles that he performed were physical in nature simply because we cannot understand the spiritual without the physical representation. The authority to rule the winds, demons, death, those things make his words about forgiveness and about salvation very real. His authority over the physical verifies his authority over the spiritual. Think about the lame man. Whenever he's speaking to the Pharisees, he says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins on earth. I say to you, the lame man, rise and walk. And he did. And these miraculous deeds are written that we may believe, and that by believing we may have life in his name. So I got these passages that we've been looking at from Luke chapter 8, if you'd like to read them. But I think it's significant what Luke wrote to lead into these stories. He was trying to tell an orderly account of the gospel, and there's a purpose from the ordering with which he chooses. Leading into this, he was telling the purpose of a lamp. Jesus says, you don't light a lamp and put it under a bowl. In other words, you don't light a lamp and immediately render it useless by covering the light that it produces. Instead, what do you do with it? You put it up on a lampstand where it gives light to everybody in the house. Then he leads into these stories. And so with the demoniac, he says, go back home where everybody knows you and they know what happened to you. Why? Because that is where you will be on a lampstand. Your light will be most useful to those that are around you. To the woman that he healed, go in peace. I bet the implication there is very similar. Take the faith that made you well, your faith has healed you, and tell how much the Lord has done for you. So I want to encourage you, find the place that you are most useful as a lamp and shine as brightly as you can to give light to those that are around you. Right now, given our unique circumstances, that may be on social media because we don't have as much interaction with people outside of virtual as we used to, hence why I'm here on the screen. But you have to ask yourself, is my light shining for all to see Jesus? Or are they seeing something else? I want you to ask yourself these questions. Give yourself an honest answer. How has Jesus changed you? How much has Jesus done for you? And how are you reflecting those things in the world around you? Are you using your unique position to reflect Christ to this dark and confused world? I hope you'll think on those things, and I hope that you will use the place that you are in to be a mirror for Christ, to reflect Him to the world that is around you.